Testing, testing. And the red light is on when you're rolling. Testing, testing. What a piece of work is man.
So if questions keep going on and your stomach keeps going, keeps reminding you that you haven't eaten, just remember that it's you keeping yourselves here.
For the after the break, we're going to have several more witnesses, and I might as well tell people now who they are going to be. Jimmy Durham will speak for about a half hour. He's going to cover a couple of areas when he speaks this morning. And this afternoon we'll have Bob Alvarez, I think, speaking on the environmental impact of resource development. Someone else who will be speaking on the new federal energy bill that has been proposed and its ramifications for Native people particularly. And then we'll have Dr. Constance Redbird Urey, who is the Native American doctor and medical consultant to the Northern Cheyenne Research Project, and she'll be speaking about sterilization as a means of repression, as well as other manifestations of repression that she is most intimately familiar with.
Are they ready?
Stuart, are you ready? Okay. Welcome Jimmy Durham, who is the director of the International Indian Treaty Council out of New York City, and who is a longtime activist in the struggle of Native American rights. Jimmy? For those who weren't here yesterday, we're, unlike other types of grand juries, we're not swearing the witnesses here. This is a grand jury that's trying to uncover various manifestations and connections with regard to one particular company and its exploitation of land and human resources. And in the Indian way, in the way of all natural peoples, they speak the truth without having to have some coercive swearing oath. So we don't use any kind of oath here. Thank you. Go ahead, Jimmy.
Tsiwaniaka is our oath. It means I'm speaking. The first thing I want to speak about is one of the witnesses who is to be here today. One of the most important witnesses is Marie Sanchez, a warrior of the Cheyenne Nation and the Cheyenne people. And she has been on the front line for years and works in isolation very often. Marie was the one person when the strip mining first began on the Cheyenne Nation territory who stood out with her rifle and held off the machines of the strip mining companies. And the people gathered around her because of her brave action. Now this woman is a real Indian leader. And the fact that she is not able to be here is another sign of her leadership. On Thursday, there was a tribal council meeting on the Cheyenne Reservation, which should be part of the Cheyenne Nation, to discuss the sale of timber on the Cheyenne Reservation to a California lumber company. Now this is in the northern plains where there are not that many trees and every tree is needed. But this is also on the Cheyenne Reservation where people suffer extreme malnutrition and diseases from poverty. People live in desperate poverty on that reservation. So this tribal council, which is in many ways a complete puppet of the U.S. government in the first place. It's a neo-colonial setup, is very tempted to sell these trees, which are irreplaceable, because this lumber company dangles some bread, some money, in the faces of starving people. That's what it comes down to. And they say, would you rather have some money and have your land destroyed, or would you rather continue to starve? Those are the two choices that were offered. Marie and some other people were fighting in the tribal council and trying to explain to the people that together they could fight and not have to sell their entire lives and their entire future to some damn lumber company in California. And that fight just started on Thursday, and she has to be there for that right now, and that's the reason she is not here. The second point I want to make is, recently I testified at the trial of Leonard Peltier, who was recently convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder of 2 FBI agents. These are agents of the U.S. government who invaded the territory of the Lakota people on the Pine Ridge Reservation and were killed by people defending their lives against these agents of the U.S. government. And every time I started to say something, either the prosecution or the judge himself would say, well, that's not relevant. I wanted to talk about treaties to the jury. And the judge and the prosecution said that's not relevant. And I wanted to talk about the situation of the people and the aspirations of the people on the Pine Ridge Reservation. And the judge said that's not relevant. And I wanted to talk about the conduct of the FBI on that reservation and the beatings that those 2 agents had been committing over the past 2 years on that reservation, beating Indian people, beating Indian children. And I wanted to talk about the 6,000 complaints against the FBI that the people of Pine Ridge have filed in the past 3 years. I wanted to bring all of those things in so that the jury could get a clear picture, and the judge said that's not relevant. None of those things are relevant. The only thing that was relevant to that judge was that 2 agents of his government were killed. There was also an Indian man killed, and there was no mention of that because that was not relevant. A couple of weeks before that, I had to testify in a hearing of Russell Means, who's facing 4 years in prison for associating with his family, for talking to his mother, for talking to his brothers, for talking to his daughter, because they are all members of the American Indian Movement, and the court says that he is not allowed to participate in the American Indian Movement or he will go to jail for 4 years. So I had to testify to all sorts of things before the judge in that hearing. And I wanted to talk about the work that Russell Means does in New York City and the work he does internationally and the commitment he has to his people. And the judge said that's not relevant. None of these things are relevant. The only relevant point is whether he did this little thing. It has nothing to do with the broader picture. That's a phenomenon of the legal system of this country. They want to keep the issues totally narrow so that no one ever gets a total picture, so that the people don't get a total picture and the jury doesn't get a total picture. So I think it's important that we have here a people's jury. And I think what we need to be doing is getting the total picture. There's no possibility of justice. There's no possibility of having a clear vision of what goes on unless you see the complete picture. And this is exactly what the system of the United States does not want to see happen, whether it's in their courts or in the people's courts. So I believe that the case of Leonard Peltier, who is facing 2 life sentences, is relevant to what we are speaking about here today. Leonard Peltier is a Chippewa and Sioux Indian who is not from Pine Ridge country, but he is a member of the American Indian Movement, and he was on the Pine Ridge Reservation as part of the American Indian Movement, helping the people protect themselves against U.S. aggression. The judge said that he had no business being on Pine Ridge because he was not an Oglala Lakota. And the judge has these 2 FBI agents beating up people, 200 FBI agents beating up people, and they have a perfect right to be there, according to him. But not this Chippewa, because he's a different kind of Indian. He's not from Pine Ridge. And I am a Cherokee. I'm not from Cheyenne Reservation. But Leonard Peltier is facing the rest of his life in prison. He's a young man, 33 years old, for helping his own people defend themselves. The reason those people have to defend themselves against the United States is because they are colonized by the United States, and they are resisting that colonization. And their resistance is so effective that the United States government has in fact decided that the best way to handle its Indian problem is to kill all of the Indians. Their idea, the policy and the idea of the U.S. government is total genocide, to completely wipe out Indians. In the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and 50s, the U.S. government thought, well, maybe we won't have to kill them all. They thought before, they thought last century, yes, we have to kill all of the Indians. And then they got a little liberal and said, well, we can assimilate a few of them. We can move them into the city slums and just steal their land and resources, and we won't have to bother with killing all of them. And they did all these programs to move us into city slums, to make us leave our land, to make us sell our land, to force us off of our land in every atrocious way imaginable. And it didn't work. It never will work. But what they decided after that, in the 60s, was that they in fact had to go back to a deliberate genocidal policy and kill all of us to get the land and resources. Now, I'm not exaggerating about that. Indians in the United States are among the poorest people in the world and the richest country of the world. We have resources on our land. We have our land itself. We have our ways for productivity and for living our own lives like we've had for thousands of years. The Bureau of Indian Affairs alone has a budget this year of $856 million to administer the affairs of 750,000 Indians. And we are among the poorest people in the world. 70% malnutrition and diseases that come from malnutrition. Now, what malnutrition means is starvation. That's what malnutrition is, a medical term for starvation. 3 out of every 5 Indian babies dead during the first year after birth in this richest country in the world. Average lifespan of American Indian man is 44 years. Average lifespan of any other man in this country, average, is 68 years. And on and on and on and on. Now that's genocide. That's deliberate, systematic genocide. The reason for that is they want our land and resources. And they will do anything to get them. What they will have not figured out yet is that we're not going to give them up. We're going to keep them. We're centering on the American Metal Climax Corporation, AMAX. And I think it's necessary to go back into history a little bit. I've been saying that we're colonized people. And a lot of people in the United States and a lot of people around the world are shocked at the idea that Indian nations consider themselves nations. And I want to say that the only reason people are shocked, the only reason this sounds like some strange or exotic or new idea, is because of the racism that the government of the United States has developed to make people think that we're not nations. Now, my people, Aniuia, the Cherokee people, have been a nation of people for about 10,000 years. There used to be 1 million Cherokees alone. There used to be 35 million people in just this United States territory before Columbus got here. There used to be 100 million people in North America before Columbus got here. Now there's 1.5 million Indians in the United States, down from 35 million. We lived, the Cherokee people lived on that land for 10,000 years. Indian people have been in this continent for 70,000 years. Think about what 70,000 years means. It means that we have been here longer than human beings have been in Europe. So what the hell is this new world they're talking about? I don't know anything about the Bering Straits. I never saw the Bering Straits. I came from Ichota, in this hemisphere, in this continent. This is where I'm from. This is where my people are from. We're not the first immigrants. We're not any immigrants. This is our land. The Cherokee people originally are from centered around northern Georgia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Kentucky, Carolinas, Virginia. And when the first white people moved in, there were many indentured servants who had been totally messed up in Europe and were sent here as indentured servants so that there would not be any social change in European countries. Because European countries like England at that time were facing tremendous social upheavals that could have changed the whole governmental system of those countries. Could have been a revolution, in other words. And their answer was to send their poor people to this new world, this new untamed wilderness that had no people except a few savages, and instilled in their heads a racism so that when they took over land of these non-existent savages in this wilderness and the people fought back, they would think, aha, they're savages, and start a war, which is the man's war. It's not those people's war. But a lot of those indentured servants saw that the Cherokee Nation, the Choctaw Nation, the Chickasaw Nation, and so on, gave them a better deal than their own nation. So they came in and became citizens of the Cherokee Nation. And we didn't divide our nationhood according to racist lines. A Cherokee citizen was a person who knew the Cherokee ways and accepted them and committed himself to the people and nation of Aniuia. And so many of these indentured servants started moving into these nations as citizens and were treated as equal that the government got a little worried and started doing all sorts of things. Then right about that, things to keep white people from joining these Indian nations, racist ideology and so on. And then the plantation system started in the South. and many black people who were slaves escaped and came and were treated as equal citizens of the Cherokee Nation and the Choctaw Nation and the other nations of that area. And that worried the man too. And then gold was discovered on the Cherokee land. And after long wars, in which 90% of the Cherokee population, 90% was killed, they moved us to Oklahoma. Completely removed us from our land that we had been on for at least 10,000 years. To land that belonged to other Indians, that belonged to the Quapaws and people like that, and that were living in Oklahoma, where they had lived for 10,000 years. Set up a competition between us. And took that gold and took the other resources, the timber. Georgia Pacific still owns the state of Georgia, just like it owns the state of Maine, and amassed more wealth for those pigs so that they were able to take over other places and keep the ball rolling, and at the same time keeping that system of racism, keeping people fighting each other, and new immigrants coming to keep things quiet in Europe, more immigrants coming all the time. Every time there was a social upheaval, move some of those poor white folks over into the Indian country and let them fight it out with the Indians. This country is built on the colonization and genocide of Indian people. And it's continually built on that. I'm not talking that it was built that way in Georgia 200 years ago. I'm talking about continually. The American Metal Climax Corporation had its first lease began by a man named Charles Sentner. Charles Sentner was a member of an organization called Custer's Avengers. This is in the 1880s. Now, stop and look who Custer was and why did he need avenging? Custer was a politician who thought he could go out and wipe some Indians out and get to be president. Instead, he got wiped out. And in the 1870s, there was a depression in this country. This was in the 60s that Custer got his, something like that. In the 1870s, there was a depression in this country like has never been seen before. It was a depression that made the 1920s depression look like a party. And there were huge numbers of people moving, white people and black people from the South, suffering from Reconstruction. Recently freed slaves who were freed to starve or to go roaming. So the United States government deliberately decided to make a campaign against the Sioux people, the Lakota people in the West, where AMAX now has its leases, and went and started wars. And that's why today the Lakota and the Cheyenne and the Crow and the Assiniboine and the Blackfeet are all on those little tiny reservations instead of on their national territory, which the U.S. agreed to under treaties in 1868. What I'm saying is that all these people in this depression in the 1870s were used against Indian people and employed in armies and so on, just so the United States could distract people from the terrible depression that was there, and just so that there would be more land for them to go to and set up little farms, which later could be taken away from them and owned by General Mills or Quaker Oats, which is what happened today. So the Sioux land and the Cheyenne land was taken over, but it wasn't taken over by those those folks who actually did the dirty work. People that own that land are Union Pacific Railroad, Amex, Exxon, Chevron, Standard Oil, Hearst Corporation. It's a gold mine in the Black Hills that's worked by Indian prisoners in the Pahasapa, the sacred Black Hills of the Lakota people. It's owned by the Hearst Corporation. It's made millions and millions of dollars. The treaty with Red Cloud and the government of the Lakota people said that anybody could come in and mine in the Black Hills if they got permission from the Lakota government first, and then if they gave back half of everything that they found to the Lakota people. This was the agreement. Never was lived up to. And today the Lakota people are in desperate poverty, and millions of dollars of gold have been taken out. The United States did not have any land to begin with. 35 million Indians lived on this land to begin with. And as the United States took over little bits of land, it got little bits more of resources and was able to get more resources, and was able to fight more people, and so on. And when we talk about General Miles, who was a famous massacre of Indian people, who then went on to the Philippines and who then went on to take over Puerto Rico, what we're saying is not that this is a coincidence, but that he and the people and the government of the United States got the incentive and got the power and got the experience to take over the Philippines and Puerto Rico by taking over our land. Imperialism is what the U.S. runs on, and imperialism of the U.S. begins with Indian people. It does not begin in Puerto Rico. It begins with Indian people, and it has set up a mentality in the people of this country, which is a mentality that fuels this imperialism, which has now got a stranglehold on the entire world. And it ends with Indian people. Because now, the United States, after it got enough of our resources and shoved us onto these smaller reservations and accumulated wealth from our petroleum, and they killed 45,000 Indians in the state of Oklahoma in the 1920s to get that petroleum, and that's our petroleum. They got enough wealth from all those things to move out into other parts of the world. They got enough experience to move out in other parts of the world. They were able to develop the mentality to move out into other parts of the world, and they did it. And when they say, well, the Vietnamese really aren't people like we are people, Vietnamese people don't really have a right to their land, and the American people passively accept that, it's because of your history with Indians that is accepted. And it's because of the U.S. government's history with Indians that the government knows how to do that in Vietnam, or in Zimbabwe, or in Southern Africa, or in South America. And now, Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, the people are freeing themselves. And you can see that process getting more intense every day. And holding on to their resources that the U.S. has been stealing. The U.S. has been using 60% of the world's resources. So Rockefeller and the government say, well, we might have to pay a fair price for Arab oil, and we might not get as much of the Arab oil as we're used to. We might not have a monopoly on Arab oil anymore. So we better do some crash programs. We may not have these third world resources. So where do they turn to? They say, Carter says, Western coal reserves. He speaks of the land as the land in the West. He doesn't speak of the Indian nations. He doesn't even speak of Indian reservations. He talks about the land, when the government talks about the land, it speaks of it as national sacrifice land, land which must be destroyed so that we, the great American people, can be energy self-sufficient. But that coal that he's got to turn to, that those companies have got to turn to, is not their coal. That coal is our coal. That coal is on our land. And that's the land we have left. We have no other place to go. And the government understands that very well, because we started fighting at Black Mesa in the 60s when they first came into the Navajo and Hopi reservations to strip mine there. We started fighting them off with guns. And this was 10 years ago. And they realized what was going to come down, and they started, the Rand Corporation and other people, developing schemes of what they would do, and now you can see the result of it. The president gets on TV and talks about sacrifice and how we've got to be energy self-sufficient for our national security. Well, I am a Cherokee citizen, I am an Indian person, and I have to be self-sufficient for my national security too. And that's our coal, that's our land. I would like to read, as part of the testimony, from a treaty that the United States government entered into in its own accord with the nation of the Cheyenne people in 1851. This is an international treaty. This is international law. This treaty is law on a par with the U.S. Constitution and U.S. law. And you can read Article 3 and Article 6 of the Constitution and see very clearly how the United States legal system considers this treaty as the supreme law of the land along with the Constitution. There's no federal law, there is no congressional act, there is no state law that supersedes or changes this treaty. This treaty is the supreme law of the United States. Article 1, the aforesaid nations, parties to this treaty, having assembled for the purpose of establishing and confirming peaceful relations amongst themselves, do hereby covenant and agree to abstain in future from all hostilities whatever against each other, to maintain good faith and friendship in all their mutual intercourse